Okay, welcome to the 84th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Andrew Kavchak. Andrew was born in Montreal and has called Ottawa home since the late 1980s. Andrew studied political science, MA, and law, LLB, at university, and then joined the Federal Civil Service to pursue a career in public policy. After a lengthy career in the bureaucracy, he began writing books that are available on Amazon, including this great book here, Westminster School, Reflections of a Border. Welcome, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Pierce. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a wonderful opportunity to connect with fellow boarding school survivors.
Yeah, it's really good to have you on the podcast. And I've spent the last week reading your book, and I've really enjoyed it. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about what drew you into writing the book. What drew you into sharing your story?
Thank you, Pierce. You know, I'd like to answer that question in a couple of parts. The first part being a description of my family background to put some context to my experience, which, I'll talk about, what happened when I went to Westminster School in the 70s. And then afterwards, conclude with a discussion of, the book. And I'd also like it probably to end with, if there's one message that I could convey to other boarding school survivors who reflect on their experience as trauma, of all the things that are in the book and the various themes and so on, if there's one thing that people get out of it, I'll highlight that. So to begin, just my background was, my parents were born in Poland between the wars, and what they endured during the war was a trauma of a unique kind. Both of my grandfathers disappeared at the beginning of the war, and in the context of my father, for example, his father was he fought in World War I. He fought in the Polish Bolshevik War in 1920, but he was a lawyer between the wars, conscripted on the eve of World War II as an officer. And when the Germans invaded from the west and launched World War II, the Soviets invaded from the east, and they captured about 250,000 Polish soldiers. They segregated the 10,000 officers, of which my grandfather was one, and subsequently murdered them all at the Katyn Forest massacre in April of 1940. And that tragedy, that war crime, was, a huge wound in my not just my father's family, but in the Polish nation. And it's something that I grew up knowing about on a regular basis. My grandfather on my mother's side, he disappeared at the beginning of the war, and my family wasn't sure what happened to him. And so my mother was brought up by a relatively poor mother with her two other sisters. So my parents met at the University of Warsaw in the 1950s. They both got scholarships to study in the West. They went to the West. They were married, so for a little while they were split up. My mother went to England and my father went to the States. And they decided not to return to Poland because after, between 1939 and 1959, they had only experienced totalitarianism and tyranny and oppression, whether it was Nazis or communists. And so they decided to stay in the West. And my father became a professor of philosophy at the Loyola College in Montreal, which is now called Concordia University. In 1968, my father had a sabbatical and went to do some research and writing at the University of Alberta, where he met another professor of philosophy by the name of John King Farlow. And John King Farlow was a very pleasant gentleman, but he didn't have any children. And he suggested to my parents that if they really wanted me to get a good education, I should go to the same school he went to. And if I went to Westminster School in London and did well, that I'd pretty well on a guaranteed path to either Oxford or Cambridge. And my parents completely bought into it. From their perspective, you know, they had suffered such trauma during the war and afterwards that for them, the idea of sending me to a place where I would be safe and secure and able to study and learn and go to the best universities in the world, this was like a paradise, a dream that they thought was perfectly natural. And they didn't seem to have any qualms at all about the idea of sending me across the Atlantic. And I was their only child. So my parents, there was never very much love between them that I remember when I was a kid. And so when I was 9, they separated. When I was 12, they divorced. And at first I lived with my mother, so I became used to not seeing my father because she moved from Montreal to Ottawa. And then when I was 13, my father had another sabbatical, and this time he took me to London. So I was getting experience not being with my mother. So in the years before I went to Westminster, I was getting conditioned, so to speak, to this not having both of my parents together. And effectively, I mean, what that meant was that when I went to England, I already had a little bit of emotional baggage and a family disruption. And also, because we'd moved around a lot, a fair bit, I mean, Montreal, Edmonton, Montreal, Ottawa, London, I didn't really feel like I had any, deeply established roots anywhere. And so when we arrived in London, my father hoped that I would write the 2.5-day long exam to Westminster and get in and start my Westminster studies. But instead, what happened was I was totally humiliated, and I describe one part of the humiliation in that first exam. Basically, I was totally unprepared. It was something completely different from what I had been used to in the previous schools that I attended in Canada. And so I failed that first exam, but my father wasn't fazed by that at all. He immediately did some research about cramming schools, registered me in a cramming school called Davis's in northern London, and I spent the next six or 7 months there, and they did an absolutely wonderful job preparing me for a second attempt. So like I say in my book, after a Dieppe-like failure on the anniversary of D-Day, I was going to hit the beaches again with one more attempt. And fortunately, I was very confident and did well. And I received word afterwards from the registrar that the housemaster of Busby's house, Mr. Richard Woollett, was willing to accept me in Busby's house. And so that was a thrill. I remember at that time feeling so excited because whenever I visited the school for the exams or whatever and visited Westminster Abbey, one got this feeling that this place was so old and just oozed so much history that to attend the school would be a real honor and a privilege. And, I looked forward to it with excitement. So in the summer of 1976, my father's sabbatical came to an end. He went back to Montreal, actually left me briefly with a Polish family that I didn't know as a boarder. So I was getting some boarding experience with private families. And then I returned for the summer. And then when September 1976 came around, I got on a plane. I was 13 years old and went to Westminster. So at the beginning, the experience was, the plan anyways was for me to be there for 4 years. And at the beginning, I was, very excited to have this totally unusual experience for a Canadian. I mean, when I told my friends in Canada that I was going to England to go to a boarding school, I mean, they were all like, what happened to you? You know? And so the initial period of getting used to the school and the class that had already been together for a while since the previous year, and getting into the institutional routine and the traditions of every morning going to the Westminster Abbey to pray, having school 6 days a week, Saturday mornings. Once a week, our prayers were in Latin at a place called Up School, which was originally built in the 1200s, I think, as the Benedictine monastery, the monks' dormitory, and that was now a auditorium or large room, a large hall where once a week we went for Latin prayers. Now, I didn't study Latin, so for me this was like being in some sort of a strange foreign, I don't want to say cult, but we were using some different language that I certainly didn't understand. And all of that was exciting, including, for example, every breakfast, lunch, dinner was in a place called College Hall, which was a 14th century refectory. It was a dining hall that originally belonged to the Benedictine abbots, at Westminster Abbey. I mean, we're talking, centuries ago. And the tables, the tables were like very thick wood, and the rumor, supposedly not proven, so just a rumor, but what we were told was that the wood came from the Spanish Armada. The wreckage of these Spanish boats on the coast. And so there was so much history there, and it was exciting for me. I mean, Canada had just celebrated its 100-year centenary anniversary in 1967, and being in a school that had a 900-year-old roots was exciting. And so when I wore the uniform and went to Abbey and classes and so on, it was a shock. And at first, I thought, great. But it didn't take very long before it turned out not to be so great. And a whole series of things happened that I didn't really understand. As a 14-year-old, I mean, I started as a 13-year-old and I had my 14th birthday. Some things sort of evolved over time, and I detected, a change, but it wasn't a change for the better. It was a change for the worse. The first thing was after a while, when everybody else in the school left after school on Saturdays, I was among just a few kids that were left in the houses. Everybody else went home. And obviously for me, a jaunt on the Concorde to go home was out of the question. So, when you're in your room alone and there's absolutely nobody, neither the housemaster nor the house tutor, who was not actually a tutor, but somebody who was available to deputize whenever the housemaster was gone. And the matron, the house had a matron. None of them really gave me the impression that they cared. They never. I never felt like I had to tell them what I was doing on the weekends. Very often I went out late at night. When I came back, I had to sign in at the gate. I was told that the school administration saw who was coming back late at night, but nobody ever told me you're coming back too late, or you should stay home or stay in the school more a little bit more instead of going to the marquee club and trying to get into the rock and roll shows. And I got the impression, and I say it in the book, that sometimes I thought I could just disappear and nobody would notice for a while. The thing is that there was this sense of abandonment, that my parents had basically dumped me in a foreign orphanage. And, in those days, of course, there was no internet. So the only communication was by snail mail. And the housemaster had a telephone. Of course, phones in those days across the Atlantic were expensive, but every once in a while he'd come up the stairs and say, "Andrew, your father's on the phone." And, usually my father would be telling me that, at Christmas he was sending a plane ticket or something. And the deterioration I began to feel, in my mind, emotionally and so on, was a sense of alienation, that I didn't really fit in here because everybody else was leaving. I was left here alone. I felt like an oddball. And this deterioration in my mental state sort of reflected itself in my deteriorating marks. I did well in French because I went to a French school for several years as a youngster in Montreal. But, my marks in the other classes were all relatively poor. And over the year, they just, despite some efforts that I made in January and had a slight increase, which surprised me, everything else went downhill. And towards the end of the year, it was just a catastrophe. I was no longer functional and able to really study. I was just overwhelmed by the amount of catching up that I had to do, which simply was not realistic or possible. Nobody was helping me. I had no mentor, no tutor, no teacher ever came up to me and said, "Look, your marks are pretty bad. How can we help you?"
You talk in your book about that one teacher who called you up 15 minutes before his class, and that sounded pretty brutal.
Well, it was, and I never forget it. There's one teacher in geography. At the end of one class, he came up to me and he said, "Tomorrow morning, show up before class 15 minutes before. I want to talk to you." And this was towards the end of the year. And I told him, I said, "Well, I'd have to miss Abby to do that." And he said, "Don't worry, it's been taken care of." So I understood from that, some teachers had decided that somebody needed to, tell me off or something. And I had no idea what he was going to say. And I remember thinking during the evening before the meeting the next morning, maybe this is going to be the first time that any adult in the school was going to ask me, "Do you need any help?" But I knew that wasn't going to be the case, because his message to show up just conveyed absolutely no warmth. And so the next morning I showed up, and he told me off in a way that seared itself into my brain, and I just never forget it. He basically looked at me in the most contemptuous, condescending manner, and his tone of voice, and he said, "What is your problem?" I was like, really? I didn't say anything to him because it was obvious that he had absolutely no idea what I was going through or what was in my mind. All he did was unfurl a litany of complaints against me about my behavior, my appearance, my marks, that I wasn't living up to Westminster standards, blah, blah, blah.
Haircut, he mentioned, I believe, the length of your hair.
Yeah, he complained about that, and everything was wrong with me, and I wasn't a proper Westminster boy. And he sort of, it was too late in the year to basically turn things around, but it's like he wanted me to suddenly see the light and smarten up just because he told me off. And I just resented him so much afterwards. But the thing is that every time throughout the rest of my life afterwards, whenever I was facing failure or a serious challenge, in the back of my mind, I just had this recurring vision of him saying, "What is your problem?" And I ended up, when I finished undergraduate studies, going specifically to law school because I heard it was going to be a challenge, and I wanted to prove to myself that my teacher was full of it. And so in that sense, it had many years later an influence on me that was positive, but it wasn't very nice. And towards the end of the year, of the school year, my marks just completely disintegrated. And I think at the end of the year, the final marks in 3 classes, I think I had the worst mark in the class. Believe it or not, I think my final mark in mathematics was 11%. Which, at the end of the year, when I went home, I felt like an utter, complete failure. And when I met my father, I just could sense how disappointed he was, that here he had this vision of me following in his footsteps and becoming a university professor by going to the greatest schools in the world and going to Oxford and so on. And instead, I was coming back after a year of him having spent a lot of good money on boarding and being a complete failure, academically and emotionally. I was just crushed. The whole experience was absolutely crushing. But I came back, and it was very, I had such mixed feelings because on the one hand, the actual place, the school itself, the buildings, and Westminster Abbey, I loved that. I really did. Every time on TV afterwards, whenever I saw, a royal event happen at Westminster Abbey, I always tuned in to watch because I could point to the places where I actually sat every morning before school. The royal coronation or the funerals. All of those things. Those I treasured. It was wonderful. But on the other hand, my experience academically and emotionally, the whole Westminster experience for me was an unmitigated disaster. And I wrote in my diary 1 week after I returned home, on July 18th, 1977, and I quote this in the book, I said, "My father doesn't understand anything. He made me cry, and then he shouted louder at me." Because my father's attitude was, if he can make me feel bad, I would have an incentive and be motivated to work harder. And in fact, all it did was it further alienated me. So when I came home or back to Canada from Westminster, my relationship with my parents had been, not totally severed, but a huge schism had opened up between us. And while with my mother, she was always very understanding, like mothers are, and welcoming, and whatever happened didn't matter. She had her boy, and so on. But my father was a different story. He loved me in his own way, and he just recently passed away. So it's been a tough Christmas. But both my parents loved me in their own way, and I know they tried to do for me what they thought was best. But the truth is that, my father dabbled in theories of human development. Believe it or not, he actually wrote a book called Mental Growth Through Positive Disintegration. What a great title. But one of his collaborators was, the person who came up with the theory originally was Kazimierz Dąbrowski. And it's all on Wikipedia and so on. But my mother also had a master's in sociology and a master's in psychology. And even with that education, they still didn't realize just how devastating sending a boy to an institution when they're too young is just not helpful, and in fact can have horrible consequences. So after I came back, one of the things that happened, which I came to really resent, was this deep down inside feeling, because every child wants to please their parents, right?
Yeah.
And so I always felt that I had let them down, and I had to do something to show myself as worthy, and try to, get their trust and faith again after this disaster at Westminster. And with my mother, that was never a problem. I mean, she never, I whatever I did, she loved me, but with my dad, it was a different story. And whenever I showed him that, okay, and my school marks were improving in Montreal once I returned to finish high school, and when I got my undergraduate degree, and when I went to law school, every time I accomplished something, I felt compelled to show him, Dad, I did okay, and he appreciated those moments, but all the appreciation always seemed to be ephemeral, in the sense that it vanished quickly. And then the next time I would talk to him on the phone, he would ask me, so what have you done? What do you have to report? What have you accomplished lately? And there always was this pressure that I felt. And it all started with Westminster, that I had to prove myself. And it went on for decades. And it was absolutely incredible. And I found that there was a time when every time my father called me, I just naturally gravitated into this conversation where I had to provide him with something to be satisfied with, whether it was intellectual stimulating discussion about the current political situation, or something that I had done. And after each conversation, I always regretted it, because I never had just a normal, pleasant, happy conversation with humor and talking about the latest movie we saw. I mean, my father never went to see movies, never went to see concerts. I mean, he just wasn't that kind of person. Never took me to a hockey game or a baseball game or a football game, American football.
Yeah.
And so the thing is that about 20 years ago, I started to realize that there's something wrong here. And when you grow up full of anxiety and depression and so on, you don't really know that there's something wrong, because you've never been any other way, right? And so, eventually as an adult, I came to realize, like, look, this isn't normal. I don't feel that, this negative it was, I always felt this tremendous anxiety, and it manifested itself in relationships as well. Whenever I got close to someone, I always felt incredibly uncomfortable, and I didn't know why. Eventually, it occurred to me that perhaps it was because I feared abandonment if I got too close to someone. Anyways, I eventually got married, and thank God I met a wonderful lady, because my wife, after we've just celebrated 25 years together, and I can't imagine anybody else putting up with all of my bullshit.
My wife as well. We've been married about 16 years, and she's amazing. Not an ex-boarder, so she's very patient and loving. So it sounds like you also have an amazing wife.
Yeah, well, she's very understanding, and I'm so grateful. But the thing is that, about 10 years ago, one thing in Canada started to come up and over again in the media, to the point where a royal commission was launched to investigate and do some hearings and write a report. And of course, it was multi-year and multi-million-dollar initiative regarding the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, about the experience of natives in the residential school system, which started at the end of the 19th century in Canada, was funded by the federal government, but run by the churches. And, you know, it's like on a regular basis, the media was reporting what the latest hearings had, you know, revealed, with so many so-called, you know, the survivors and the second generation and third generation children who had, you know, grown up hearing about the tragedies that their parents went through. When all of these stories started to be reported in the media, it rang a bell with me, in the sense that it resonated with me, because I thought, well, I've been to a residential school too. And the thing is that these aren't common in Canada. I mean, I think in my entire life, I've only met in Canada, I think 4 people who have been to boarding schools. One in Switzerland, one a person from Alberta who was sent to a boarding school on Vancouver Island, and another person who went to one in Nova Scotia, and he told me that it was because his parents were divorced and his mother died, and his father was a frequent traveler for work, and so, you know, the father couldn't leave his young boy unattended at home for prolonged periods. So, from a practical point of view, he went to a boarding school, and he seemed happy about it. But for me, it was a tremendously you know, unusual experience for a Canadian. And when I heard about, you know, over 100-something years, I think it was a total of 120 years, because the last one's closed in 1990s. I think the statistics was a total of 150,000 natives had been through the residential school system, and what they endured was, you know, it just beyond description. And so a couple of years ago, I decided to start researching what I had you know, been through, and studying the history of Westminster. And, you know, when I left Westminster, I thought, you know, my experience was so unusual that I was duty bound to write a story about it. But I just never got around to it. And I ended up, you know, during COVID, during the pandemic here, having time, and I had started researching and writing books on topics that were of importance to me. And, you know, 2 of them I wrote about the Catton Forest Massacre, for example. You know, this was an intergenerational trauma that I suffered. One of the books was called Catton Grandson, No Permission to Forget. And, you know, I started writing these various books, and I wrote 2 books about 2 failed relationships and periods in my life that didn't go very well. And I used pseudonyms, and I found that after I wrote them, I felt like a ball and chain that had been around my ankle for decades had been broken off. I felt a new sense of freedom, and you know, some thoughts that had been in my mind every day for decades and weighing me down. Suddenly, I felt like I had been released.
Did you feel that with writing Reflections of a Border?
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why I started to write it, because I realized with these other books about these other, you know, events that happened to me when I was 18 and when I was 30 that were traumatic, and in large part a result of my experience with Westminster. I just felt, you know, that I might do myself a favor, and this might help me heal and feel better. And so I began to research the history of the school, and found out that the former headmaster, when I was there, Dr. John Ray, had in fact written several books about his time as headmaster and about education policy in general. So I got all of his books and read them all, and I love them because they helped me to understand not only what was going on at the time that I was there, but some of the context, the background, and it was, they were so well written, and I often felt like he was just in the room and we were having a conversation. And on top of it all, I'm glad that I didn't write the book earlier, because while researching the history of Westminster, I also researched the history of public schools, and then inevitably came across Nick Duffel's book, The Making of Them. And when I read that book, I wanted to give Nick Duffel a hug. It was such a joy, because for the first time in my life, I could read what happened to other kids, and it resonated so much with me. And for all these years, I'd always wondered what happened. I had no understanding of what happened, and an explanation of what the consequence would be, and so on. And Nick Duffel's book was the first time that somebody actually was helping me to understand what I had been through. And then, of course, Joyce Severian's book, the boarding school syndrome, and put the two together. And I felt like, in the interview that you did with Nick, he talked about RAC, right? The recognition, acceptance, and then change. So the first step in any, path towards healing and feeling better and so on involves understanding what happened, that recognition. And that wasn't possible until I read those two books. And so I decided to write a book that would be not just, my story, but also potentially of interest to people who would, because I felt that I had to provide enough of the context. So I had to include a lot of the history of Westminster. This wasn't just any school. This was, a unique place. It's just like, Eton and all these other ones, Harrow and whatnot, have tremendous histories and a sort of a cultural status inside the British establishment. And so I felt compelled to include a lot of that in the book. But I also wanted to, and the last 30 pages of my book constitute annotated bibliographies about books about the school, public schools, the Dr. Ray's books, as well as lists about the history of public schools and boarding school syndrome. But the last part of the reference section, and I thought the book might also be a useful reference for some students, not just of, British public school history, but also, the syndrome and a case study and so on. But the last chapter, or the last part of the book, is an annex with a listing of books in the field of writing therapy. I just want to backtrack a little bit and just mention one thing. After I published my book last year, I received a message from one individual suggesting to me that I didn't suffer from boarding school syndrome because I hadn't attended a boarding school long enough. It had been just 1 year. And they suggested instead that when you combine that experience with Westminster with my family disruption and the baggage I brought with me to Westminster, along with the intergenerational trauma that, my parents lived through in World War II and so on, that what I potentially, suffered from was complex trauma. Now, I'm not a psychologist or a psychotherapist, and I'm not all that familiar with the nuances of the differences between these various syndromes or traumatic, different kinds of trauma. But when I read about boarding school syndrome, I can say that everything I read, I felt that it resonated with me. I got it. I felt that abandonment, disassociation, the whole idea of developing a strategic survival personality. I mean, at one point I went through a phase where I thought, I'm going to believe in Jesus.
I remember you talking about that guy that you were going into his study, doing
That's
Bible
right.
studies.
There was one senior student at Busby's house who was among the very few who went to the 1 day a week at the Abbey service was voluntary, and out of 500 kids in the school, only about a dozen would go, and they were referred to as the God Squad. And this gentleman, a young student, senior boy who was working on his A levels, I mean, he tended to walk around with a smile, and he always had a copy of the Bible. And he was the only one, especially in the middle of the school year at Busby's, who consistently smiled at me. And so I went to visit him several times in his room, because he had a single room, and talked with him about my challenges and how I felt. He was the only one who listened to me, and I was really grateful. I remember crying in his room that I was so unhappy. But the thing is that every time we chatted, he always ended the discussion by, taking my hand and saying, "Let's pray together." And for a little while, I tried real hard, it's Jesus, love you, But after a couple of weeks, I gave up on that. And then I went through a phase where I thought, maybe I should just stop talking.
Yeah,
I think,
I remember you saying that, and I was shocked, and I read it yesterday, and it brought me to tears because I had the same experience. I stopped talking as well, and to hear someone else have that experience, it was like, it's
yeah,
shocking.
well, to
How's that
me,
for you?
well, I just remember that, at the school, I was doing so badly that I thought, this is unreal. I can't believe I'm really here and this is happening to me. And I thought maybe I could just pretend that I'm not here and observe from a distance. So my corporal body, I'll just stop talking and just sort of pretend I'm looking at what's going on from a distance. And it was very strange, because I noticed after a few days that I got the impression that to a lot of people who previously thought I was just a goof, that I suddenly became more tolerable.
Sounds like you dissociated. You just stepped out of your body.
Yeah, that's how I felt. That's what I tried to do, because this experience was just so unpleasant. And unfortunately, this period of not talking made me even more miserable, because by nature I'm not an introvert. I'm more of, I suppose, an extrovert. I need people. I want to talk to people. When I see people doing something interesting, I just naturally tend to ask them, what are you doing? So for me to not talk and try to clue myself out and fade, I mean, this is one of the I think Nick Duffel explained in his interview with you that there were, those who conformed, those who were rebels, and those who were crushed.
Yeah.
And I was, I guess, I didn't, I never got into trouble, in the sense that I wasn't a rebel, so I never got into trouble. Of course, I smoked in my room and stuff like that, but I was never brought before the housemaster or the headmaster for punishment of anything, so I wasn't really a rebel in that sense. But in terms of conforming, I mean, I wasn't doing very well. So to me, I felt towards the end of the year that I was crushed. And the thing is that what I found was that the more I read about this Nick Duffel's book and George Cheverian, I thought I'd like to, based on my experience, writing some other books with a pseudonym about two other traumatic events in my life that made me feel better afterwards, because for years I'd been thinking about these things every day, and after I wrote the books, I felt really liberated, and I stopped thinking about them, and when I did think about them, it was completely different. And so I decided to do a little bit of research on writing therapy And at the end of my book, I include an annex where I discuss a little bit the history of writing therapy and list a number of books about memoir writing and how writing can help people heal from traumatic events and so on. And if there's one thing that perhaps boarding school survivors who feel a need to heal a wound, and I think all children who are separated from their parents, like Joyce Savarian said, have a wound. Whether it's healed or not, the thing is that if you feel that you have a need to heal, there are obviously various ways. One of them, I just very much regret that I didn't live in England and able to attend the workshops that were started to be available by Nick in the 1990s and so on. Here in Canada, that of course nobody talked about this, right? I mean, I didn't hear about these, and so for many these kind of group therapy sessions and workshops, and then of course psychotherapy, and in many cases, obviously, depending on the extent of the trauma, it'll take a long time and involves concerted effort. But if there's one thing I'd like to convey, and use my book as an example, it's that one thing that may help, and it's not for everybody, because writing can sometimes be re-traumatizing, and it can create all kinds of problems with other people alive who may be involved or not. So it's not for everybody, but writing therapy can take different forms. It can be, writing a journal, or writing an essay, writing a letter, and an unsent letter even. It can be writing a dialogue, but it can also be writing a story or writing an autobiographical account. And, there's always the question of to publish or not to publish. And one can publish using pseudonyms, change all the names. I did that, and I greatly appreciated the opportunity because it really helped me. But with regard to the Westminster book, I changed a few names of some of the people, but I put my name on the book, and two of my classmates, one wrote a foreword, one wrote an afterword. Several people are named in the book. For me, I felt the right thing to do. And I can honestly say that the moment I clicked upload, and when I was satisfied with the manuscript, because I sent a draft to the school, and the school archivist reviewed it, provided some comments about some dates and so on, and had some other people review a manuscript as well. And when I was satisfied that it was done, and it took me 6 months to write, but that moment when I uploaded it to Amazon, there was a tremendous sense of relief. And I realized now that with so many things in life that occurred to me, I felt a need to hold on. And so many people, when you discuss negative things that may have happened, they'll say, look, it's time to turn the page and forget about it and so on. Look to the future. Don't look to the past. But the truth is that I always considered that what happened to me to be important, because it was me. It was a part of me, and it helped to explain why I am the way I am today, and why I behave the way I do, and why I think the way I do. And if I were to erase it from memory, there'd be something wrong, because then I would be like not having any legs, And so the thing is that when I write the book, it's not that I get rid of something. I just put it somewhere else. To me, the book is the story that I held around my, I was reminded that expression from Coleridge's Ancient Mariner about the albatross around your neck. I had these albatrosses around my neck, and when I wrote this book, the one about Westminster and its impact on me and how I felt when I came home as a complete failure, that I just felt liberated. I was free. The thing that I had kept inside me for all these decades, and it's almost a half century. Can't believe how long it's been.
Do you feel better now?
Absolutely.
After having written it.
Because this thing that was eating away at me, I've taken it out and I put it somewhere. And if I ever want to see it again, I can just pick it up and read it. But I don't have to think about it anymore. And I don't have to be afraid of losing it because it's right here. And if my children or grandchildren, if I ever have any, if they ever want to know why their grandfather is so weird, they can just pick up the book and that'll give them an idea.
Thank you. So I guess the question I have then, you talk in your book a bit about the history of boarding school. I mean, what did you learn about the tradition of boarding as you were researching, as you were looking through?
Well, boarding education originally was, run by the monasteries and religious orders, teaching local poor boys Latin and so on during the Middle Ages, medieval period. Then boarding schools evolved. They started taking at Westminster as early as I think it was the 15th century or 16th century. They started taking fees for purposes of educating non-local boys, and the boarding school tradition really evolved. Some of the schools like Winchester, Marlborough, Shrewsbury, Eton, Westminster were founded or refounded, with royal charters by Henry VIII or
My school was with a royal charter.
Okay,
quite close to yours actually. It moved out in 1902, but it was based in the centre of London, quite close to Westminster originally.
Oh, okay. Well, the school, Westminster, often says that it was refounded by Elizabeth I. And after that, it seemed that by the 18th century, with the British Empire being, as big as it was, so many, leaders in Britain who were, colonial administrators or in the military or the, civil engineers who were going to far off colonies to build one thing or another, or the missionaries, all of these people, resorted to sending their kids to boarding schools in order to ensure they were properly educated in Britain. And so it became part and parcel of the, the British upper middle class and upper class, fabric of the British society, right? And so, of course, with so many of these things, and this is, sometimes success in life is not based on what you know, but who you know. And who you know is often based on, had you been to the same school? And so, obviously, over the past, 150 years or so, there have been waves of, criticism about how the public schools and boarding schools in England have perpetrated a class society, which fundamentally conflicts with the idea of equality of opportunity. And notwithstanding, the frequent efforts or pronouncements by opposition or the Labour Party or various interest groups to reform or abolish these schools seem to grow. They seem to thrive. They survive, and now I think they call themselves independent schools. And back in it was, I think, the 1880s. One headmaster from one school wrote to several other headmasters and invited them to a meeting to discuss the implications of one of the acts that Parliament had passed to regulate some of these schools, and that evolved into the Headmasters Conference, and now it's called the Headmaster and Headmistress Conference. I often sort of laugh when I think about the possibility of some boarding school survivor workshops being advertised in the Headmasters Conference annual report or newsletter. I mean, I used to get the Elizabethan, which is the Westminster School newsletter, and now, of course, it's all online. So whenever it comes out, they send you a link. But in it, there can be advertisements from various businesses, and it'd be really nice.
It's a good idea. Yeah, when our documentary comes out, maybe we should put it out to the Headmasters Conference and see what they say.
Well, the thing is that's an industry association that you can be sure whenever Parliament or some political institution is contemplating changes in the regulations of education, that they're going to speak up for their perceived interests, and a lot of it will probably be behind closed doors.
Oh, yeah.
On graduates.
Well, that sounds like what you're saying about the tradition of boarding school. It's done behind closed doors. I think you talk about that a bit in your book. It's it's who you know.
Well, when you ask the question of what did I learn about the public schools as part of British history and so on, I mean, there's no question that and so many of the books that are now exposing the negative impact, the books, but it's the one Stiff Upper Lip by Alex Renton.
Or Richard Beard, Sad Little Men.
Sad Little Men, and the one by the gentleman you also interviewed, Vercake.
Robert Vercake, yeah.
Posh Boys.
Posh Boys, yeah.
Right, so these books sort of expose some of the things that society may not be aware of that go on behind closed doors, and it's this elite connection, upper class, that always maintains its interests. And that's the way it's been for not just decades, but a lot longer than that.
Thank you. Yeah. I know Robert Vercake talks about that, and the provost of Eton spoke in I think his opening letter when he got the job a couple of months ago. He said something along the lines that his best friends are all from Eton, top 8 or 9 friends, and he says, when I meet someone who doesn't come from Eton, I don't trust them, something like that. Or he says, I can't understand how anyone, he somehow sees them as less than if they don't go to Eton, and that's it. It's that what Robert Vercake is talking about. It's those connections. So.
Well, I read, if I can just add, Piers, I recently read in some article somewhere, I can't remember exactly where it was, but an exposure that this past year or the year before, Eton didn't get as many students placed at Oxford and Cambridge as another state school did.
Really?
And there's one apparently was very good, that managed to place more students at so.
Wow, because Robert Vercake talks about that. He says in his book that it's usually a state school, the chance of you getting into Oxford and Cambridge from a state school is 1 in 2,000.
Right. Well, apparently one of these schools that's not an independent school, funded by the state. So I don't know if it's still the terminology, whether it's called a comprehensive school or a grammar school or what. But I read somewhere that one of them coincidentally somehow managed to place more graduating students at Oxbridge than he did last year or the year before. I think I read it in a newspaper article, maybe in the Telegraph or the Times or something like that.
Interesting. That's really good to hear, because usually it's about 1 in 20 who go from a public school to Oxford and Cambridge. I think there was 4 from my year.
Right.
There's 100 on my year. There was about 4 went to Oxford and Cambridge. So yeah, I mean, another question I had was, what was the number one thing that stood out for you at boarding school? You know, both positive and negative. Especially coming from a tradition, you know, from Canada, where boarding was not, you know, for
right.
people. What stood out for you when you got there? It sounds like it was a really exciting at the beginning, but it quickly dipped. You know, what was the?
Yeah, well, you know, in terms of, you know, the positives and negatives of boarding, you know, I guess I could answer that by, you know, boarding in general and then Westminster in particular. Generally speaking, you know, in terms of boarding, I think there's no positives.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I can see that for some families, it's a practical option, and in some families, maybe a practical necessity. You know, like my friend well, he's not a friend, I just met him once, but, you know, one person in Canada here who told me that his mother died and his father was a frequent, you know, away on business. And so his father had him go to a boarding school in Nova Scotia. Well, you know, that may have been in the absence of, you know, an aunt or uncle, you know, and cousins, the only practical option. So, you know, that would be a benefit very limited, I think, to some cases, because the general negative for boarding, I think, is, you know, this. Joyce Savarian made it very clear when she said that the detachment of children from their parents creates a wound. And that's it. It's if you take children away from their parents and put them in an institution where nobody's going to hug them, nobody's going to, you know, give them the love. No one can substitute for the love of parents. And in my book, I give, for example, the couple of pages where I quote from the former headmaster of Marlborough, John Dancy, who, you know, spent in a book that he wrote in 1964, I think it was, you know, he spent 5 pages talking about the advantages of boarding over a normal home. And, you know, when you read this,
I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, you know, when you read this, you know, I had the impression, and this is while I was researching my and writing my book, I came across this because John Ray had referred to the book, and so I followed up and, you know, got the copy of the book. And when I read those passages about how great boarding is compared to being at home, you know, where the first example he gives is that the housemaster, who very often isn't married and has no children of his own, as was the case when I was at Westminster, is supposedly a much better expert at raising teenagers than the father is, because, among other things, he's more objective and able to dole out justice and punishment objectively. You know, when I read these pseudo arguments, I just had this impression that this guy must live in a society with leprechauns and unicorns and, you know, some completely different world. And I concluded that section where I tried to summarize his arguments in my book by saying, you know, he is remarkably naive. Remarkably naive. Now, in terms of Westminster and the positives and the negatives, I mean, you know, the positives, I mean, I felt, you know, if I had been a day student living with my family in London, my experience would have been completely different. But as a boarding school, the good things I think were, if I was mature enough, I would have been able to enjoy more the actual setting and perhaps find some stimulation in the lessons. But the teachers at Westminster, and John Ray says this in his books, that the teachers at Westminster thought they were university professors or lecturers lecturing to university students. And he says in his book, it's incredible. I was so glad when I finally found it, because for so long I thought, was it me? Was I so stupid or what? And he basically says that the school was focused on getting as many as they could into Oxford and Cambridge. And they invested most of their resources in the scholars and about half of the student body that had a decent chance. But he said in his diaries, that for the other, or his book, Illusions of Grandeur, he says that for the other 50%, they're in trouble because they need help. They need to be motivated. The student body, the teacher population weren't doing it. And many of the students were not living up to their potential. And many actually were not doing well in their A levels, and some failed. And he actually says a number of them needed to go to cramming schools after Westminster to take their A levels again. And he concluded by saying, I'm surprised the parents didn't complain. Now, the parents probably didn't complain because, like me, they thought, it's me, it's my son. He's the idiot. He didn't thrive in Westminster. But John Ray says that even though some teachers proposed the creation of a tutorial system, he opposed it on the grounds that pastoral care was most effective when it was haphazard. Now, he said that most students knew where to get help when they needed it. I had absolutely no idea. No idea.
Yeah,
none.
He talks about that, the Reverend, you say.
Yeah,
the
Reverend,
like...
Reverend Willie Booth was described in so many passages in his books as being, so wonderful in terms of providing pastoral care. But I remember thinking, I can go to him if I have some sort of spiritual problem, and he can provide some sort of ecclesiastical advice. But my problem wasn't Jesus. So I had no idea if he had any idea of how to help me improve my marks in mathematics. So now I understand that now at the school, when you go to their website, they've got counselors for everything, so that kind of problem that I had. And by the way, they've adopted apparently a policy that boarders from abroad have to be at least 16. And one of the tragedies that was for me very, very painful was the very first term, when right in the middle of term, I was suddenly told, the school's closing next week. You have to go. I said, well, go where? I'm 14 years old. I've got, 10 pounds a week allowance money that my housemaster has in trust. What do you mean the school's closing? That was terrible. I mean, my parents had no idea. And I ended up turning into a beggar, asking one after another of my classmates, if you're not going on vacation to the Riviera or something, do you think your parents would mind a Canadian crashing on your couch for a week? It was the most embarrassing, humiliating thing. And during that whole time, it was very difficult for me to think about anything else because I was facing, a week of homelessness if I didn't find some place to go. I mean, I was facing a nightmare situation. My parents had no idea. They just looked at the calendar that they got and saw, okay, it closes for a week, but of course we're paying them for our son to board there, so he's going to stay there. Well, no, but they didn't check, and nobody at the school bothered to check with them at the beginning of the term whether they understood the fact that they were going to lock the door and I was going to be kicked out of the school. It was just a horrible situation. Well, now they've got these policies that, nobody from abroad can board at the school until they're 16, and they have to have some place to go when the school closes in the middle of term.
That's good. That sounds like that's changed. I mean, that's for me one of, we're doing this documentary. One of our wishes is that early boarding closes, certainly before 13. And as Nick Duffel talks about in his book, before 16. So that they're doing, and they're allowing people from abroad to come in 16 plus.
Right.
I think also, as long as they bring in emotional intelligence, I think counselors, that's a good step, but still there's no parents for the younger kids. You still don't have parents there. And also, I was just doing some research on that over the weekend, was there's still no touch, which changes it decreases heart rate, it increases oxytocin, decreases blood pressure by having touch. You don't have that for 9 months of the year. So yes, you've got mobile phones, but that's not the same as having touch.
Right.
So I've realized we've been talking about an hour and a quarter. So, and where you've got to go off to another meeting in a bit. So are there any final bits that you would love to add before we start wrapping this up, Andrew?
Just one other interesting anecdote, perhaps, if I may. I've got one chapter towards the end of the book called Westminster's Nonconformity. And I wrote it because as I read through all of the literature about the school, I was absolutely flabbergasted by this repeated assertion by former headmasters that Westminster somehow inculcates a tradition of nonconformity. And these, Dr. Ray and another, I can't remember his name now, another headmaster, I quote some of their passages in various books where they talk about, Westminster graduates having this being taught at Westminster nonconformity. And of course, I quote also something from the 1800s, which refers to Busby in a couple of centuries earlier, who was the headmaster, in which case, he asked some student, why don't you believe this? And this student responded, well, truly, sir, you're the one who taught me, not to conform, type of thing. And the thing is that I thought this was absolutely bizarre, because anybody who's been to a boarding school knows that with the regimentation, the whole thing, it provides you with absolutely no freedom, and you have to conform. And then I found, this remarkable statement in something that, in one book that Dr. Ray wrote, in which he said that historically, and he quoted, the typical boarding school experience in the 1960s, that with the machinery of compulsion that was in place, with prefects or monitors who still had the right to beat you, and the requirements to attend this and attend that, and your whole freedom of movement was regimented and regulated and so on. He said that the key to survival and success necessitated conformity. So how can you be, on one hand, in a school that claims to promote and inculcate nonconformity, when at the same time, the way to succeed in the place is to conform? But it's actually more complicated than that, because the choice of words, I think, was poor. What he really meant was, and he says elsewhere, and I quote that as well, that he said that the school primary objective is to teach independence of mind. And then there's a series of quotes that I put in which he says the important thing was for the children to develop their own position. But the thing is that not all positions are of equal validity, right? I mean, some positions are stupid, some aren't. So then at one point he says, that children should make up their own minds and only have a change when provided evidence and be open-minded enough. And that, I think, is key. That really what the schools should be doing is not just teaching the facts and mathematics and so on and history, but teaching people logic, critical thinking, and how to reason their way through any problem or proposition and determine what their position is. But just adopting a position, saying, well, I've made up my own independent mind, that's not particularly good, because your position may be awful and not based on anything rational. So I say that if Westminster really wanted to have a brand of education that was unique and one to be proud of, that I think they should institute in the curriculum and make mandatory courses in critical thinking and logic.
Thank you. Great ideas. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and really recommend people get a copy of this book. It's a fascinating read, very heartfelt and very touching in places. And I love the references to the bands you visited, like Pink Floyd and some of the
My first concert was Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
1976 at Earl's Court. I'll never forget it.
Oh, amazing, amazing. So yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. And yeah, I'll put a link to your book in the description. And yeah, thank you so much for writing the book.
Thank you very much, Pierce.
Okay, my pleasure.